I am Pavan Panarajan. I am the CEO of ExxonMobil Oil Company. I'm talking to you government officials today about alternate jet fuels. Thank you for taking your time from your busy schedules to come and listen to me today. As you may know, commercial, private, and military jets all contribute to emissions. These emissions interrupt two important nutrient cycles, the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. Let me start by telling you about the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle starts in the atmosphere where carbon is present as CO2. Land plants absorb CO2 along with sunlight to perform photosynthesis and make food. So now carbon atoms are stored in plants or trees. Herbivores eat plants. They use some carbon but release the rest as CO2 into the atmosphere. The secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and the tertiary consumers eat them. In this way, carbon is moving through the food web. Animals release CO2 when they die and their bodies are decomposed. Also, burning wood releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. Another path in the carbon cycle is when carbon from the atmosphere gets absorbed by oceans, where it is used by the aquatic food producers such as seaweed. Larger sea creatures eat the seaweed and the carbon passes through them. Finally, when these creatures die, the carbon in them is released as CO2 into the atmosphere. Human activity is disrupting the carbon cycle. We humans are burning fossil fuels when we use our vehicles. Also, industrial farming produces CO2, and factories such as power plants produce CO2. All this CO2 gathers in the atmosphere, but we can't plant trees fast enough for the CO2 in the atmosphere through the carbon cycle. The CO2 prevents heat from the sun from escaping back into space, so the plant gets warmer over time. This causes all sorts of trouble, like rising sea levels, from polar cap melting to droughts and to bigger and stronger storms. I will tell you briefly about the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is inert. It does not easily react with other elements, so it needs to be fixed to be usable by plants and animals. Nitrogen can be fixed through the atmospheric fixation, by biological fixation, and industrial fixation. Most nitrogen fixation happens through biological fixation. In this process, nitrogen is fixed by bacteria that lives in the roots of peas, beans, and clover plants. Nitrogen in the plants then move into plant-eating animals, and then into secondary consumers, and then into tertiary consumers. This process is called assimilation. When an animal dies, the protein containing nitrogen is decomposed into ammonia. Then the nitrifying bacteria turns ammonia into nitrates and nitrites. These are turned into nitrogen gas by denitrifying bacteria, and it's back into the atmosphere. Humans impact the nitrogen cycle in a few ways. The use of fossil fuels creates nitrous oxide and other compounds containing nitrogen and oxygen. These are also greenhouse gases, and increase of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere also leads to global warming. Fuels are a significant source of both CO2 and nitrous oxide, which affect the carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle. But I am happy to tell you that the FAA has already approved 5 alternative bio-based jet fuels. My company is heavily investing in research to make these bio-based fuels cheaper and more efficient. The alternative fuels approved by the FAA is shown here. Alternate jet fuels are made out of biological material such as corn, sugar, and forest waste, agricultural waste, solid waste, fats, oil, and grease. The alternative jet fuels reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and can reduce can carbon and can be carbon neutral. Commercial airlines and the U.S. military is interested in these fuels, but this currently fuels are very costly to produce compared to jet fuels. So we will have to find ways of making the production much cheaper. Also, we have to study the overall impact on water usage, land usage, soil quality, and biodiversity of producing the biological material needed for these fuels. I hope the government will join us in investigating and research to alternative jet fuels. Thank you.